Daniel Paisner is a journalist, author, and podcaster. Now, I notice that on your website, you don't start off, at least, by mentioning that you're a ghostwriter. Why is that?
I don't know. I don't think of myself primarily as a ghostwriter. It's just a piece of my writing life, one aspect of my writing life. It happens to be how I make my principal living, but that's not what I see when I look in the mirror.
Okay. He is a podcaster with more than 70 books to his credit, including 17 New York Times bestsellers. He is the voice, quote unquote, of Serena Williams, Steve Aoki, John Kasich.
John Kasich, former Ohio
Kasich.
governor. Yeah,
Yes,
Kasich.
yes, former, well, he was a presidential candidate at one point, wasn't he, or in the primaries?
He was. He was one of in that deep field of Republican candidates in 2016, and he was the last man standing before Trump got the nomination in 2016.
Right. Also, Whoopi Goldberg, Denzel Washington, Ray Lewis, Anthony Quinn, and dozens of other name above the title celebrities. Can you explain name above the title?
That's a Hollywood term when a star is big enough that his
Yes.
or her name sells tickets. Their name is often mentioned above the title of the movie on the marquee.
So, in other words, on the dust jacket, the name of the author would be larger than the title, probably.
It could be.
Yeah.
You can you can make the case for that. It wasn't always the case in these books that you mentioned, but they were big stars.
Daniel is the winner of 2 NAACP Image Awards for his work with Shark Tank panelist and serial entrepreneur Damon John. I find this interesting. You work with a lot of Black clients.
That's true. It's just sort of a happy accident. I don't know how that's come about. I've worked with a lot of women. I am not that. I've worked with a lot of Black personalities. I am not that. I've worked with a lot of Republicans. I am not that. So I think, the great thing about this type of work is I'm allowed to be a chameleon. I can slip into someone else's shoes. And as long as they're able to share their stories with me, I can help them find a way to share them with readers.
Right. We'll get into that. That's the how of it all. You host a podcast called As Told To, which features interviews with fellow authors about their experiences ghostwriting. And you have written several novels, the latest of which is entitled Balloon Dog, which was published in June 2022. Welcome, Daniel, to the Bibliophile.
Thank you, Nigel. Happy to be here.
So, ghostwriting or a ghostwriter is someone who is hired to write a text which is officially or publicly credited to someone else.
I think that's where the term originated. We are ghosts because we are silent. We are the unseen hand in the making of some of these books. But of course, the term has been attached to speechwriters who work behind the scenes, to joke writers who write gags for comedians for $6 or $8 or $10 a pop, to songwriters who pen hits for some of our biggest artists. So I kind of use the term loosely on the podcast. A lot of my friends who do this kind of work in publishing sort of stiff arm the term. They don't love it. They think there's something pejorative about it, that there's a taint to it. And they prefer to call themselves collaborators or story architects or editorial consultants. But whatever you call it, the work is much the same. The work I do on behalf of others, it's written in their first person. I do get credit in a lot of cases. Sometimes I don't get credit because there's a good business reason for me not taking credit. Sometimes I don't want credit because I feel like it might get in the way of me soliciting other work in sort of an opposing arena. But the first person voice is usually the subject's. So I write as someone else, for someone else, advancing an agenda that belongs to someone else.
Yeah, if I had a book coming out with my name on it, I'd be maybe ashamed is too strong a word, but I, especially if I'm hiding the fact, I think I wouldn't like that. If I'm going to put my name on a book, I want to have written it.
Well, I get that, and I'm sort of with you on that in terms of books of my own. But I also get the other side of the conversation. You know, if you have achieved a certain notoriety or lived a book-worthy life that brings you to the table in the first place, where publishers want to publish your story, and you've never done this before, it can be an intimidating thing, and there's no shame in reaching out for an assist. And what I try to do when I work with clients is to let them own the process as much as they want. If they think of themselves as a writer, we'll figure out a way to work so that I let them leave the process feeling as if they really did write this thing. And I was just there for them to lean on and to help them carry this to the finish line. If they don't have the patience or the time or the inclination to go that way, I'll do a lot of the heavy lifting for them. I think there are many different ways to go about this, but I don't think the people I've worked with have felt any shame in reaching out to someone else for an assist.
No, no. I guess the question is, where do you draw the line between being a ghostwriter and just simply an editor?
It's a thin line, Nigel. You know, a lot of what I do is editing. You know, every project is different. I've worked on some books where my partner has not lifted a pencil or made a notation on the Word document that we share. I just interviewed somebody on my podcast who worked with the rapper Rick Ross. And Rick Ross has two New York Times bestselling books that he wrote with this ghostwriter. His name is Neil Martinez Belkin. And Rick Ross very happily and proudly says he still hasn't read these books all the way through. So you
Yeah.
have all kinds of extremes. And my job is to really fit myself into whatever this artist, actor, movie star, athlete, politician, whatever they're comfortable with. I try to accommodate myself to that.
I just can't get past this though. Like if, for example, learning that Hillary Clinton didn't write her memoir taints her somehow in my eyes. It's like, well, did she write it or didn't she write it? And how much of it did she write?
Well, I think that's unfair, Nigel. I think I think we need to put some elastic on the term writing. I think she owns her books. I don't mean by copyright. I mean that everything that's between those hard covers comes from her in some way. Whether she was actually banging at the keyboard initially or whether it came from conversations, at some point becomes immaterial. I wrote a book once, many years ago. It was over 20 years ago at this point, with Whoopi Goldberg. The publisher quite reasonably suggested, look, you know, she came to fame as a comedian and as a writer. She had a one-woman show. Her fans were conditioned to expect that she was a singular artist and this was her voice, and it should not be polluted or corrupted in any way by another writer. They were rightfully going to the bookstore expecting to buy something that came directly and organically from her. So
Yeah.
they asked if I would not take a cover credit on that. I was happy to bend to whatever Whoopi wanted. Whoopi had her backup. She said to the publisher, to Simon and Schuster, "Look, this is crazy. We'll take his name off the cover if you think that'll make a meaningful difference in terms of sales, but I'm going to write about it." And then we went together and wrote a whole chapter in her book where she effectively acknowledged me as her collaborator and also talking about how there's no shame in getting a helping hand. And she likened it to affirmative action and other policies in place on a societal level, and said, look, you know, we all need an assist from time to time, and this is how these books get made. This is how I was able to fit this into my busy life. I
Yeah.
needed somebody else to help me with the nuts and bolts of it, and there's no stigma to it. There shouldn't be any stigma to it.
Right. And I guess that's the thing. It's the line between editor and ghostwriter. How much of the work did the actual the person whose name goes on the book, how much work did they actually do? I guess it's as you said, it's a sliding scale. I just want to know as a consumer that if I am buying a book that's got Hillary Clinton's name on it, that she did most of the work.
I think you can assume as a consumer that in every case, the book is born with them, lives with them, and it comes from them. Whether it comes from them in the active art of writing or it comes from them in some other form, whether it emerges through conversation or some back and forth work on a Google Doc that is shared. I think you can feel confident in almost every case that the book flows from that person in a meaningful way. But look,
Right.
Nigel, you don't expect, and your listeners don't expect, that every speech you hear from a politician is written by him or her. You might make a distinction in your mind about what sort of orator Barack Obama is compared to what sort of orator his successor was. But let's be clear, both of them had assists before they stepped to the lectern in crafting those speeches. One might have had better speechwriters than the other. One's persona might have come through more consistently and more believably, but they were not sitting there and just speaking off the cuff or reading from their own notes.
Yeah. The word honesty is coming up here in my head.
I mean,
But
I
yeah,
get what you're saying. I just think we've come to this place on a cultural level where it's an accepted convention. I think the marketplace has been conditioned to expect that people have had a little bit of help. And where that's not the case, then that is brought into the light and highlighted in some way.
are you saying then that all of these autobiographies and memoirs of celebrities and executives and politicians, there are some, like Winston Churchill did all his own writing, so I admire him as a writer.
Mhm.
What percentage of these books are ghostwritten versus edited?
It's really hard to say. I mean, it's impossible to know. I think though that in reading the book you can make a determination. So if you pulled a book off your shelf, at least I can, because this is how I make my living and I traffic in this area. So I sort of have a good nose for this thing. I can sort of smell a ghostwriter. If we do our jobs well, we're supposed to pass unnoticed. The best books that I've worked on really feel like they came organically from the subject, and then I can feel I've done my job well. But a seasoned reader, a seasoned collaborator should be able to tell. But even somebody from outside of publishing who's not himself or herself a writer, you can crack the spine of a book and you can sort of look for clues and find a way to see if this is a genuine piece that comes directly from that subject, like you could tell when you were reading Winston Churchill. So it's impossible to go and put a percentage across the industry and determine what the difference is. But I think on an individual case by case basis, you can look at a book and determine how that book came out into the world. And I think we're splitting hairs about whether we call it ghostwriting or editing or
Yeah.
editorial consultancy. All of my books that I write by myself, I've done a bunch of books, I've written a bunch of novels. There's a copy editor at play there. There are editors who offer big picture suggestions. So where do you draw the line and say, well, that's too much help?
Well, that's what I'm trying to get at. That's why we've got this term ghostwriting. I mean, it's in there, right? So
it's in there. It's one of the things, if you look over the years at how these books are credited on the cover, there was a convention when I was a kid. I suspect I might be a little bit older than you, but when I was a kid, these books, the byline often said "as told to," which is where I get the title for my podcast. And lately, in the past couple of decades, it's been with. From time to time, you see "and," But I find that confusing as a reader, because then it goes directly to the question of voice. Well, if there are two authors writing and sharing these duties, who owns the first person in that narrative? That gets very confusing. So I kind of like with, and that's what I go for when we're banging this out contractually, insofar as this stuff is determined on a contractual basis. That's my preferred credit. As told to is sort of archaic, but it's interesting to look back at the history and the evolution of this form to see how it was regarded among publishers and booksellers.
Right.
The very idea behind a phrase like "as told to" is as if this book was dictated to somebody else. So in some ways, that diminishes the contribution of the ghostwriter or collaborator.
Well, that's right. They're just taking dictation versus helping to form the message, the ideas, the stuff that the client wants to say to the world.
Yes, but think about it. If you're coming to this enterprise as somebody who's never done this before, and yet you have a meaningful story to share, I think you'd be foolish not to reach out to somebody who's experienced in this world to help you shape and guide your story. It doesn't matter what you call that person's role or how you identify that person. The meaningful piece here is that you recognize that you need some help and some coaching, and that coaching can take many, many forms.
Well, look at JFK's Profiles in Courage. I mean, that was Sorensen, right?
Right. And yet it's publicly acknowledged that he had help there, but it's also recognized as JFK's book, and it helped to stamp the early part of his political career, right?
Helped get him into the White House.
Right. So it sort of framed his persona in the public eye, but it was kind of an open secret that he had help on that.
I don't know, maybe open secret within the Beltway, but I don't think most people know that Sorensen wrote that. I mean, here we go again, trying to get a figure on.
Right.
But I think most the general public think that that's Kennedy's book.
I think at this point, 60 years on,
I should clarify
at the time, correct.
Yes.
At the time. Again, I don't necessarily see it as a deceit of some kind. It's just sort of a fact of life.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting qualification. Is that obviously these people are often really busy. They do have important messages to convey. They just, in many cases, don't have the time to do it. I suppose they could do it if they really, really felt strongly about not wanting to have something out there that they didn't actually write, though.
Absolutely. But look, there's nothing dishonorable about this transaction, either between the subject and myself, or the subject and their potential readers. However, I've worked with people, Nigel, and I'm sure you've seen celebrities promoting their books where they tell you the origin story of their books in interviews, and they say, I would stay up late at night and I had to pour myself my second whiskey and I was banging my head against the wall trying to come up with it. And that's all a crock of hooey, and that's dishonorable. So if you take this baton and run with it in the direction of duplicity, then I think you have a problem. But as long as all the players are adhering to convention, there is nothing dishonorable about this, and I don't think we're pulling the wool over readers' eyes. It's sort of a known and expected fact of publishing life that this is how the sausage gets made when it comes to books like this.
Okay. And the sausage is made by you assuming their voice or their style of thought, by mimicking their tone, their expressions. Is that what you do?
It's part of it. I mean, I sort of have to be a good mimic. I sort of have to be like the Rich Little of the publishing world, There's a old-timey Canadian reference for you guys.
Thank you. Yeah. Even though he lives in LA, like all successful Canadians.
So it's part of that. It's also part of, a lot of these people, they've never written before, so they don't have a voice on the page. When people talk about capturing someone's voice, we don't write the way we speak. Take, your favorite novelists over the years. If you sat down next to them at dinner, they might come across completely differently. So in some sense, you're creating that voice anew on the page, but you're doing so in a way that honors their public persona. And I'll give you a good example. I worked on a book with a guy who's since become a very good friend of mine. His name is Izzy Paskowitz, and he was from a nutty California surf family, very famous California surf family. He grew up in a camper with 8 siblings. He was never educated. All he did was go to different beaches and live out of their camper. It was a real wacky childhood. He went on to become a world champion longboard surfer. He had an interesting story to tell. And when we sat down to write it, it felt to me, it has to be of a piece with who this man is and how he lived his life. And the reader should feel as though they're sitting around a campfire on the beach, sipping beers and swapping, talking story with this guy. And it shouldn't feel like somebody's got leather patches on their elbows, sitting in an ivory tower, smoking a pipe, and like it was written. Now, that's not to say that this guy, Izzy, is not a bright guy and that I had to dumb down the material, but it had to feel connected in some way to the way he lived his life and to, the connections he made with the people he's met on his travels. It had to feel like him. So together we created a voice on the page that honored that ideal, or at least that was the objective.
Yeah. Well, and again, to use an overused term, it's genuine or authentic, that's the feel of it.
Right. And if I had sat down and wrote these flowery, flourish-filled, sentences that might have been lovely to read, it would not have honored who this man was and what his brand was or his personality was. And so how do you achieve that as a writer? Well, you use a lot of sentence fragments. There's a lot of staccato rhythms. You reach for a sort of unconventional writerish tricks that kind of make the reader feel like you're in a newbie's hands, but nevertheless he's a good storyteller. You try to get out of the way of the story as a writer and let that voice that I hear around that campfire. A lot of these stories were told to me over a campfire. You try to find a way to let those stories flow onto the page in a way that's true.
Right. Okay. Now, I had a chance to just quickly communicate with the novelist David Mitchell,
right,
about this topic, and his first novel is called Ghostwritten. That's the title of it, and he plays around with this.
Interesting. Okay, I did not know that.
Yeah. So as a result of our conversation, I think I'm going to have to read it. It's a big, long book. But
as many of his books are, I mean, he's an interesting character too, because what I've found in his books, I haven't read that book, some of his books are indistinguishable from one to the next. It's hard to find the through line that suggests he's written both. Cloud, was it Cloud Atlas? That was kind of all over the place and trippy and weird. And then he did a rock and roll novel recently, which was terrific, but it was also very linear and very straightforward. And it felt more like a piece of commercial fiction than artsy, out there, trippy fiction. And it didn't feel like it came from the same writer at all. So even novelists who are writing on their own experiment with voice and find different ways to communicate different stories to, in his case, maybe different sets of readers.
He has some questions for you.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so do you adopt the voice of your clients for the narrative? Now, I'm not quite sure if he means just there's a separate narrator, and then there's, I suppose, the words you put in your client's mouth, the dialogue or whatever it is, but that's the question.
Yeah, I don't know that that question necessarily applies to the type of work that I do. Yes, I adopt the voice of my subjects entirely for the narrative because
Yeah.
they are our spirit guide as we turn from page one to page last. We are in their head, we are in their voice.
So you
You know,
don't neutralize it then.
I try not to. I mean, I might work with somebody, I'd have to look back on my bookshelf of titles to see if there are exceptions to this, and I'm sure there have been. But I think for the most part, the answer is no, you don't neutralize it. You let them carry the day. You know, think about how a lot of these books are read. Think about how you read. It's a very intimate
Yeah.
transaction. And when you come to this transaction as the reader, you have a certain set of expectations. And if you're buying a celebrity driven memoir, a book by somebody who's known to you from some other world, from an accomplishment on the field of play or in the field of politics or in the business arena, whatever it is, you come with a certain set of expectations. And I would not be doing my client a service if I flew in the face of those expectations. So we have to, you know, present that brand, that voice, that personality from page one. And that has to be sustained throughout. One exception to that, now that I'm speaking, early on in my career, I wrote a book with Geraldo Rivera, the American journalist, back when he was a rock and roll reporter, you know, with long hair and sideburns, working for ABC's 2020, and he was, you know, this vagabonding, globe-trotting, swashbuckling reporter.
Sensation seeking?
Not in the beginning.
Okay.
At some point later on, there might have been a pivot, but he was a reporter. He liked to interview people. And one of the narrative conceits we reached for together in his book was he came to me at one point early on. He said, "You know what? Let's don't just take my word on this. Let's talk to somebody else." And I went out on his behalf. Sometimes he did these interviews, sometimes I did them. And we interviewed the other players in the stories he was telling. And we broke from his narrative, sometimes for a page or two, sometimes for a paragraph or two, almost like an oral history that we injected into the middle of his narrative to kind of either color or echo whatever point he was making in the text. So if he was telling a story
Yeah.
about, you know, some conflict that he covered overseas, he'd send me to talk to his cameraman to give their perspective about what was going on at that shoot on the day. And in this way, we kind of surrounded his story with other perspectives.
Yeah, in fact, this is what another Canadian author who does ghostwriting, Jonathan Kay, has told me, is that it's important to interview all sorts of people around your main client, not just family members, if that's permitted, but people who may have been with that client at certain times in their lives, that, you know, the highs and the lows. Is that what you get at as well, or not?
You know, it is important, but I don't necessarily think it's important for the same reasons as that person might. What I find is useful, and in some cases invaluable, is the memories of others are great lubricants for the memory of my subject. You know, in your own life, you might have a hard time telling me what you had for dinner last Tuesday. But if you know, if you connected me with whoever it was that you had dinner with last Tuesday, together, you guys can sort of figure out the menu. So, you know, I like to talk to people because they help unearth stories that the subject doesn't think to share. I never
Yeah.
get to this stuff unless that stuff gets downloaded from their brain into mine. And sometimes the only way that happens is by reaching out and talking to people in their circle. When I interview people in their circle, I don't do so as a journalist. I don't take an adversarial view. I'm not out to trip up
Yeah.
my guy or to fact check my guy.
Well, that's
To
because you're getting paid by your guy.
But it's also his story. You know, my job is not to question, you know, I question his story privately, but my job is not to challenge him or second source his stuff. It's his story. And if this is what he wants, I did a book with Anthony Quinn towards the end of his life. Anthony Quinn, this famous,
Yeah.
talk about a name above the title, a movie star, 4 Academy Award nominations, 2 Academy Awards, a big, bold life, a product of the studio system in Hollywood. And he told me a story towards the not towards the end of his life, but in the 60s and 70s, I believe, he was approached by some at this point, I no longer remember whether they were Republicans or Democrats, but some group in California that wanted him to run for governor. And he told me this story that he was filled with bluster and bravado. That was sort of his brand. That's how he lived his life. And I couldn't find anything in the public record or anything to corroborate this story. Nevertheless, Tony Quinn told this rich, colorful, detailed story about, these movers and shakers that really wanted him to throw his hat in this particular ring at this particular time in his life. So what is my job there as a ghostwriter? I'm not a journalist. I'm not there to challenge him. So I challenge him privately, and I could say to him, Tony, I really can't find a paper trail here to sort of help you with your memory. I'm not saying I doubt you, Tony. I'm saying I need a little help here. I let him know that there was nothing in the public record to confirm this account. And he was determined to tell that story. So the story lives in the book. And my feeling is, this is his book. This is his story. He's reached a stage in his life where he's entitled to tell it however the hell he wants. And it's not on me to challenge him on that
check.
or to keep him from that.
I see. Okay.
It is on me to potentially warn him that there might be fallout. Hey, if you put this out into the world and there's this other account that conflicts with what you're saying, then you're making trouble for yourself. That's my job. But it's not my job to say, no, I'm not writing this.
Yeah. Okay. Again, this is Jonathan here talking about the necessity for some kind of friction, or not just you taking dictation, some sort of, maybe not friction, that might be too severe, but some sort of collaboration to get to what actually the client wants to say or has to say.
Well, I'm not taking dictation, Nigel. I mean, I think that's really what the idea and the concept was when this phrase ghostwriter took hold. That's really not it at all. People don't finish their thoughts. They don't finish their sentences. They don't connect the dots between what they're telling me in one moment to what they tell me in the next. What I do is I take these conversations and I grow them into a proper narrative that's going to engage the reader. And sometimes that means putting words in their mouth. Sometimes that means connecting thoughts that they didn't connect themselves. And they have an opportunity to visit this material again. So once I do that on someone's behalf and I send it to them for their review and they sign off on it and say, okay, this works, then to me, it's as if they said it. Once they sign their name to it, then it's theirs, even if I help them put the words together.
I see. Okay. So
it's not dictation at all. Very often I, come up with whole paragraphs out of thin air just based on where they were going, but never quite got to.
What about in the case of someone like Trump? Would you feel, this is David Mitchell again, would you feel the need to reframe the spoken sentences into English that works on the page?
I think my obligation is to reframe the words into sentences that don't embarrass my subject and allow their points to come across in a readable way. So if the person is just speaking gibberish, then gibberish won't find its way into these pages. I was once asked to interview Bill Cosby for a foreword to a book that I had also worked on. And Cosby kindly agreed to write the foreword, but he asked me to help him for it. This was, of course, many years before the scandal. Probably the Cosby Show was still on the air in the US. He was a hugely popular star. And I interviewed him not for a long time, maybe 20 or 30 minutes. And what he shared was absolute gibberish. I mean, the caricature that you see of him on Saturday Night Live, where comedians lampoon his, no, it's Jello pudding or whatever. And there was not one coherent sentence that came out of his mouth. And So I took that and I said, what the hell am I going to do with this? I got to write a meaningful forward for this book. So I tried to get at the essence of what he was trying to say and what he never quite got around to saying. And I sent it off to his people and it came back and they said, fine. So that's what went in as the forward.
Okay.
So, I think you work with what you have, Nigel, and you make the best of it. But at the same time, you do try to honor the personality of the person you're writing for. So what I sent to the Cosby camp was something that sounded like Cosby. His feelings were reflected on the page. But if I had just transcribed what he had said to me, it was gobbledygook.
Right. And as you say, it would have been embarrassing. I mean, you don't, and he wouldn't have accepted it anyway when you presented it. So,
Right. He said, what the hell is this?
yes,
But
exactly.
in doing that, you do a disservice to him, you do a disservice to your reader. And I would be doing disservice to my overall client, whose book it was. And this forward was meant to launch and frame in a positive way.
Yes. Okay. Another question here from David. Do you accept commissions? And you actually, I think, alluded to this. Do you accept commissions from people whose moral compass points in a different direction to your own?
Sometimes, yes. More so at the beginning of my career when it was all about the work. Now I've had a certain level of success so that I'm able to pick and choose what I work on next. Of course, I always have the luxury of hiding behind that ghostwriting handle. Nobody has to know that I worked on these things.
So in other words, anonymity kind of works for you in some cases.
It can. However, I would not want to advance an onerous set of ideals that I feel strongly opposed to. So even though I'm a liberal Democrat, that doesn't mean I can't help a Republican write his or her story.
Even if that means the ruin of the country?
Well, look at how Tony Schwartz, who famously collaborated with Trump on his first book, The Art of the Deal,
Yes, look how he came out.
distanced himself and said, "Look, I regret that book. I regret helping to build that brand." But in the moment, he did not. So when he was faced with this dilemma, he chose to go forward with it because at that time, all Trump was a carnival barker real estate showman in New York City, and it was harmless to
Yeah.
prop him up in this way. I just interviewed a terrific journalist named Charles Learson on my podcast. The podcast came out this week, the week that you and I are speaking. And he's out now with a new book that's generating some controversy, a biography of Anthony Bourdain. Charlie Learson, early in his career, was a ghostwriter, and he helped other people write these books as well. And he wrote book 2 with Trump, which was called Surviving at the Top. It was not nearly as successful as The Art of the Deal. Nevertheless, it was a New York Times bestseller. And Charles Learson was writing for Newsweek, I think, at the time. And this was his sideline gig. And he looks in his rearview mirror and regrets the role that he played in helping to burnish that Trump brand as well, all these years later. His book that he wrote with Trump, Surviving at the Top, is actually in the news now. It's written about at length in Maggie Haberman's new book about Trump, which is called Confidence Man, which I think is the number one book on the planet these days. And she says that book is more authentically Trump than The Art of the Deal. So in that moment, in that transaction, Charles Learson didn't have a problem with helping a guy like Donald Trump set his thoughts to paper and put that book out into the world. Because again, all Trump was at that juncture was a showman.
Yeah.
He was a personality. It's only in retrospect that you look back and say, geez, what have I done? Would Tony Schwartz or Charlie Learson take on a Trump book now? I hardly think so. I worked with Ivanka Trump on her book over 10 years ago.
You were co-author, right?
I was a co-author. I was a ghost, same sort of scenario there, and this was in the 2008, 2009 area. And the idea of a Trump presidency was not on anybody's mind, although we're now learning it was on Trump's mind to a degree. So in some ways, I too helped to burnish that brand and to put that Trump name out there as sort of the imprimatur that means successful business people, or that they can get things done. So I had a hand in that as well. I don't regret that. She was lovely to work with. She was very professional. She took this job seriously. Of all the people I've worked with, she really did roll up her sleeves and write this thing with me. So that was great. Would I have worked with her again after 2016? No. So I think circumstances change. So all of which circles back to your original question. I would not work with somebody now whose views I saw today as objectionable, that were so, violently opposed to my own views, or who I thought was, dangerous to help advance their views in the public forum. I would stay away.
And that's because you're economically secure now. Is that what
No,
you're saying?
I think I always would have stayed away in that case, if I really saw those sorts of red flags. Now, it's not a matter of economic security, it's more of professional security. I know there'll be work. If I say no to Project A, there will be Project B later on in the week that I can consider. And by that, I mean, I look carefully at books with people whose views don't align entirely with my own. That's never been a problem for me before. But it's all a matter of degrees, Nigel. In what ways do they not align with my own views?
Yes. It's interesting how this conversation is sort of flitting around the flame of morality.
Well, here's an interesting example, as long as we're not too far away from our Trump conversation. So in my work with Ivanka Trump, she told me a story about her father, and her book. Understand the conceit of her book. It was meant to be a primer on how to succeed in business for young women. So she was offering business tips and strategies, how to get and stay ahead. And she was talking about the importance of punctuality and keeping to a firm schedule and being on time or whatever. And to illustrate the point, she told me a story about her father, who apparently is also famous for his punctuality, at least in Trump circles. And she told me a story about a time when he was married to Marla Maples, wife number 2, and they were on a private jet. I don't know where they were. I don't remember. He was off doing his thing, and Ivanka was on the plane on this trip too as a child. And Marla Maples was on this trip too, and they all separated, and she was off on a shopping spree. And the Donald had announced that there would be wheels up at, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And everybody knew they had to be on the tarmac at 2 in the afternoon. And Ivanka was on the plane at 2. The Donald was on the plane at 2. There was no Marla Maples. And he orders the pilot to take off because Marla Maples should know that when he says we're leaving at 2, we're leaving at 2. And Ivanka tells me this story, and she could see Marla Maples on the tarmac, getting out, stepping out of her limo, running to the plane as it's taxiing down the jetway. And so she shares the story with me as an example, as a positive example of how important it was to her father to be prompt. And I'm hearing this story saying, gee, Ivanka, are you sure you want to tell this story? He comes across as a bit of a prick in this story. I don't know that this presents him or your family in the most positive light. And she said, no, that's how it was in my family. And that was an important lesson. So the story lives in the book. The story has been cited by other Trump biographers and historians as an example of some of the sort of dysfunction or the disconnect that went on in that household at that time in Trump's life. And it did not bring the message across that Ivanka had intended. My job as a ghostwriter was to point that out to her and say, are you sure that story says what you want it to say? And I gave her the chance to look at it again, perhaps from a different perspective. And she thought that story belonged. And so that story stays. It's not my job to tell her we can't run that story. It's her book. But again, ultimately, I don't think that story served her or her family well.
It's funny, just talking about that specific event. If she hadn't been on the runway, okay, and I would have possibly taken off. But the fact that she was there and she, you could see her, that's the nub of it.
But Nigel, it's not just that it doesn't look good. She thought it looked good. She
Yes.
right. It's not
Yes.
like that it didn't look good and she was willing to live with it.
Yes,
She
I
she
understand.
thought
Yeah.
it painted him in a positive light. That's
That,
the tone deafness or the disconnect that was at play between the lines. Again, I can't keep my subjects from themselves. I can just point out where I
yeah.
think they might be taking a misstep that doesn't serve them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the message is, of course, there's dysfunction alive in virtually every family, but it
Yes.
just, I
But we
guess.
don't all need to write about it.
Okay, here's David's last question, and that is, can you think of 3 things about being a ghostwriter that people try to imagine what your profession is like, but that would never imagine? In other words, let me just redo that. Can you think of 3 things about being a ghostwriter that people try to imagine what your profession is like, but would never imagine?
I don't know how really to answer that. I mean, I think one of the things I hear from people when they find out what I do is they say, gee, you get to meet all these famous people. They think it's glamorous and exciting. And I suppose it might be to some people on some level, but what people don't realize is, in order for these books to work, and in order for these stories to flow from them to me, I need to see these folks in their environment. So what does that mean? That means I very often stay in their house. I have dinner with their families.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in their guest bedroom. I travel with them. A lot of the athletes I've worked with, when they're in season, they only have time if I go on the road with them. Steve Aoki, who's an EDM DJ, very popular DJ. He fills stadiums. He's played to 100,000 people at festivals all over the world. He doesn't sit still, and the only time I can sit with him was if I went on his tour bus and lived with him for a week. And sometimes you see people in their natural habitats, and you get a very different glimpse of who they are and what their life is like. Now, I mentioned Steve. He turns out to be lovely. He's terrific. He's bright. He's insightful. So this is not a knock on him, but you do see past the public veneer when you work with these people. So when people say to me, my, oh my, what a glamorous way to live, you meet all these famous people. Yeah, that's great. But you also see them as they are. They are just people.
Dan, that's not hard to imagine, though.
Well, some people are starstruck. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you put me on the spot, Nigel. I had to give you some
Okay.
answer.
Okay.
I'm dancing as fast as I can.
Right. Understood. Understood. Well, I did repeat the question, though, didn't I?
You did, which gave me an extra two
Yeah.
seconds to think about
Yeah.
it.
Um, that just as far as non-disclosure and confidentiality clauses, this is sort of anonymity. Are you saying that that's slowly changing or not?
I think it is changing. I mean, I don't talk, there are certain projects I don't talk about. There are certain projects that are in the works that I don't talk about very often because those books haven't even been announced yet by the
Right.
publisher, even though they're, almost complete on my desktop. Is it changing? I think it's changing. It's changing in ways that satisfy me from my own singular perspective and for other ghostwriters. The only reason, Nigel, that it matters to me if my work is acknowledged is because it helps me get other work. I don't need to see my name on the cover of a book when I pass by a bookstore window. There's no ego involved. I don't think you can do this kind of work and have an ego.
Right.
The only reason it matters to me is because it's currency of a kind. And that has changed. I think it's open. We talked about an open secret earlier about Kennedy's Profiles in Courage. It's known in the publishing community who's written this or that book. For the most part, there are obviously exceptions to that. And so if a book is successful or if a book connects with a certain group of people in a meaningful way, that might impact me being considered for a similar book at a different publishing house, people will be able to find me and say, "Oh, you wrote X. We'd like to
Yeah,
bring you in and talk about writing Y."
yeah, it's a
That's
business
the
consideration.
right.
Yeah.
It's not about ego. I don't need to
That's
look at
funny
this.
though, because I did get this sense that maybe you felt that you wanted to have your name out. This is, around your novels, is like you want to be considered a legitimate author on your own.
Well, I highlight the work I do as a ghostwriter because I believe in social media and on other landscapes, it might help me build up an audience for the work of my own. I think you're right there, but again, that's a marketing thing. In truth, the one has nothing to do with the other. You're not going to pick up a copy of my Serena Williams book and say, "Oh, this is a really great story. I have to read Daniel Paisner's new
No,
novel."
no, but
Right?
what I might think is, shit, this is very good writing. Maybe he's a good novelist.
Maybe. I've found that there's really no carryover, and there's also no carryover in the minds of publishers. So publishers absolutely don't care. I mean, this book that I'm hoping I can get around to talking about, Balloon Dog, was published by a small independent press. Nobody at Simon and Schuster or Random House or Dutton said, "Oh, gee, Paisner's written 17 bestsellers. We must bring his novel on board." There's no carryover in
That's
in that
interesting.
regard.
I'm actually sorry. I'm surprised. I figure a good writer is a good writer.
Yeah, but you know what? Nobody looks at the spine of a book like this one to say who wrote it. Again, even if we're credited, that anonymous piece of the ghostwriting transaction still applies. Publishers might know who we are and might tap us to write a similar book by
Yes,
a
yes.
similar
They,
artist,
they're
but I don't think
pigeonholing you.
readers look like you. If you have a book, if you're read, I don't know what nonfiction books you've read lately, but if you've read a celebrity memoir recently, nobody's going to look at that and say, "Oh, gee, I read the Viola Davis book. I have to read the next book by her ghostwriter."
I don't know about that.
There,
No, if I appreciate that something is really well written and I do, and I know who wrote it, even if it is the ghostwriter, as long as they're acknowledged, there is a chance I would seek out.
I think the reason why I land at this independent, small publishing house is because publishers didn't agree with you that there was a carryover.
That's
You know,
interesting. Yeah, because you didn't want to end up at this independent publisher.
well, I would have preferred. I mean, they've done a great job, but I would have preferred to have a big operation behind me and a big publicity machine and distribution and all the bells and whistles that come with being published by a major publishing house. You're
Right.
with an
Well, the
indie press.
prestige too.
Well, you're with an indie press because the big boys weren't interested. So, or they didn't think they could make a return on their investment or whatever it is. Again, the prestige doesn't matter to me in the same way it doesn't matter if I see my name on the cover of a ghostwritten book in a bookstore window. The prestige only matters is you're more likely to get major review attention if you come out of one of the bigger publishing houses. You're more likely to be ignored if you come out of a smaller house. So,
Right, right. And I guess as an author, obviously, like all authors, you want as many people to read your stuff as you can.
that's exactly right.
You,
And what
you
I'm finding in this podcast that I started about a year ago, we're about a year into this thing, is that everybody who does this as a pivot. They didn't come to this line of work with intention. They came to this line of work by happy accident. They were writers. They were looking to supplement their writing careers. It was an assignment. It was a freelance gig, and it worked out well, so they try it again. Or maybe it helped to bridge the space, if they had writer's block and they were having trouble getting out of their own way and coming up with an idea. It was a way to earn a living as a writer. They had a certain skill set, and this was a way to tap that skill set. So I
right.
hear today from a lot of young writers who say, "Oh, I want to be a ghostwriter." And again, I'm not trying to be discouraging to them, but I don't want to encourage them in that because it should not be your career of first resort as a young writer, because ultimately it takes a certain personality, it takes a certain discipline to spend your days writing on behalf of somebody else.
You talk glowingly about the connection that you're able to have with these people. I mean, there's to me that's one of the most important things that you can get in life.
For every meaningful connection I make with somebody I work with, there is a less meaningful connection on the other side. You know, not every collaboration goes swimmingly. Some are neutral, some are unhappy experiences, and some are thrilling experiences. But all of that work that I do on behalf of others really buys me time to write books of my own. You know, if I were to have my way, I would be able to sit in my underwear all day and write whatever the hell I want, right? But I don't have that readership. People are not going to follow me down that path in ways that will keep a roof over my head or put my kids in orthodontics or send them to college. You know, so I have to find a balance. So I try to write, you know, the deal I made with myself as a young writer was we'll write one of theirs and I'll write one of mine. That bargain has shifted over the years, either because I've been busy or, you know, it's hard to say no to certain things when, you know, you're trying to keep ahead of the bills and all that stuff. But that's really how this Balloon Dog project came about. This was an idea that I wanted to pursue. I had what I thought was a interesting conceit for a novel, and I was looking to find time in my schedule where I could, you know, carve out my days and focus exclusively on that. And I was lucky to be able to do that because of the success I've had in this other realm.
Obviously, I suppose it's more rewarding, fulfilling to be able to write something that that you want to write. Obviously, that's kind of obvious. Does that make your life more meaningful to be able to say exactly what it is that you want to say and that it came from your loins?
No, I don't think that's it at all, because really, in the end, nobody gives a shit what I have to say, right? It's
No, I suppose if it does take off, people will care what you say.
Yeah, that's true. But I think the real difference for me is it makes the process more joyful and joy filled. You know, sitting down to write and losing myself in the work to me is the end game. That's the gratifying piece. And
But it's your work, though. It's yours. That's why I
well,
think that's different, isn't it?
No, because and here I think is the distinction, at least for me as a writer. People ask me all the time, don't you ever get writer's block? I don't get writer's block when I'm writing someone else's story because the story has been lived. You know, my job as a ghostwriter, as a collaborator, is to lend shape and structure and voice and tone. But I know how to get from point A to point B because that person has lived
Yeah,
those
yeah,
moments.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
as a novelist, I sit there, I have an idea, I have characters I want to spend some time with. I have no idea how we're going to get from point A to point B. And to
Right.
me, those days, I mean, think of it in your own work. I'm sure there are times where you look up and the time has flown and it doesn't
Oh,
feel
yes.
like work at all.
Yeah.
That's the way I feel when I'm working on something of my own. Not because I have something burning I need to put out into the world that I want people to understand comes directly from me. It's because I can get lost in the work and the time fairly flies.
That's the payoff. That's the reason that you're doing this,
To me, that's the reason I'm
so that
doing
you
it.
can lose yourself in.
To me, it's because my days are filled in this joyful way. When work does not feel like work,
Yes,
it's a
yes.
it's a great good thing.
Sure
You know,
is.
I'm not saying I don't enjoy this other work. Don't
No,
misunderstand
no,
me.
understood.
But it
Yeah.
is clearly work. It's craft. It's a difference between art and
Yes.
craft, really. You know, one is,
Right.
you know, one is my art and one is my craft. And I don't want to be so full of myself to think that my works are great works of art, but that's really the distinction. In one
And
sense, I'm an artist, and in one sense, I'm a craftsman.
and ideally what you want to do is get paid to be an artist.
But since I can't, since I get paid a little bit, I get paid enough as a craftsman, calling on my skills as an artist. You know, it's kind of like my version of the struggling actor who's waiting tables until he gets his big break.
Yeah.
However, in this case, I'm also a writer. I'm also sitting in my underwear doing this work. It's the same banging on the keys and staring at a blank screen, uh, but it's also different. It's quite a pregnant pause you got going on there, Nigel.
Well, that's because I'm able to edit, aren't I? I'm gonna pause here for as long as it takes to come up with something it's just about to gel here. I suppose you're really talking about creativity. You're talking about your desire to do something that's joyful, but to do something that is inventive and that is, as you say, hasn't been lived before. It's almost godlike, the author who is creating something and doesn't maybe even know where it's going. That excitement of, hey, where's my own imagination taking me? Is
Right.
that what you're getting at?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just want to have some sort of freedom, or at least I want to have some sort of freedom of expression, some sort of excitement of, heading into the unknown, not knowing what you're going to find on the other side. And I think you could probably say the same of any artist in any medium who's knocking on the door of finding a listenership, an audience, a readership. I mean, think about a great guitar player who's playing in a cover band and is making
Yes.
decent money playing
Yeah.
other people's songs, but at night he goes home and he writes his own music, and he's desperate. He's not desperate to have people hear his music. He's desperate for a way to maybe monetize that so he can spend less time playing other people's music in this bar band and spending his nights that way and live his life differently.
Because it's more fulfilling and
That's the
free.
hope. That's the hope.
Okay.
That is the hope.
So what makes you so good at what you do in the ghostwriting business? It's like you've been successful. You are successful. So why are you so successful?
Oh, I think I think I'm good at what I do without blowing smoke up my own butt, but that's really not it. I think anybody who sort of does this at that level brings that same set of skills to the table. So I think what I'm good at, the reason why I keep finding work is I'm I'm a nice guy. I try to be a good
That's a
hang.
big part of it too, isn't it? The relationship,
Well, it
obviously.
is. I listen to people. A lot of this work is not really work. I'm traveling with these folks. We're sitting with their families. We're just, shooting the breeze, and there has to be a personal connection. So I really try to connect with the people I'm working with. So much so that I've sometimes tried to talk myself out of work. Somebody might reach to me and say, "Hey, we'd like you to do this." And I'll say, "I'm happy to do this. It would be an honor to work with you on this, but do your due diligence. Talk to as many writers as you can, because it's at this stage of the process that you're able to determine if there's a connection, because that's going to be the most important piece. It's really the
Yeah.
interpersonal piece. Let's
Yeah.
assume that everybody you're talking to has chops. Okay, what do you do? What else is there beyond the chops? You asked before. I seem to have worked with a lot of women, a lot of black people, a lot of folks who are not like me. So sometimes I'll talk to a woman and say, I'd love to work with you, but maybe you should talk to some female writers and see if you're going to be more comfortable sharing intimate stories about your love life or a miscarriage or any other personal stuff that we're going to be slogging through. You might be more comfortable sharing that with a woman. So I think the difference maker for me has been the personable piece of it. I connect with people, and I've formed such good relationships with some of these people that we've done 3 or 4 or 5 books together. So we keep
Mhm.
we keep going back to it again. But if I could circle back, Nigel, a little bit, because it connects in some way to the themes we were addressing in the last beat in our conversation. One of the themes of this new novel of mine, Balloon Dog, it's all about the nature of art and who gets to decide what value we attach to works of art. It's about the theft of a Jeff Koons balloon dog sculpture. Now, I'm sure your listeners have seen these iconic balloon dogs that show up in public squares and on mantelpieces. It's kind of like the smiley face of the pop art world. It's just a balloon dog that a clown made for you as a kid when you were at a birthday party. Nevertheless, these sculptures sell for tens of millions of dollars, and Jeff Koons has built this fabulously successful career. And I use that sculpture sort of as a metaphor in this story to push the characters and hopefully the reader to reflect on who decides the value of a work of art. How do you break through the noise and get noticed? When we behold a thing of beauty, who is the beholder? Who gets to decide? And in a lot of ways, that speaks into some of the issues that I face in my own life as a would-be artist, as a wannabe widely read novelist. Right now, I'm a widely underread novelist.
Isn't it luck, Dan?
It could be luck. It could be the, aligning of the stars. It could be, yes, it comes down to a whole bunch of variables that are out of your control as an artist. And all you can really do is to do the good work. But I take the occasion, the narrative thrust of this story, the theft of this sculpture, this giant sculpture that turns out these bad guys have no ability to fence because it's enormous and it's a known thing and they're stuck with it. But it's a chance to reflect on how, on a societal level, we've sort of attached certain value to certain pieces of art and not to others.
And what's your conclusion then? Why have we done it to some and not to others?
I think the conclusion is you just kind of nailed it. Is it's luck. It's happenstance. It's chance, and you never know when the stars will align in just the right way on your endeavors, whatever it is you're pursuing. And all you can do is keep up with the pursuing.
Yeah, you just keep creating and making stuff and
Yeah.
and trying to get what this is. I was in a writers program workshop this past summer in Prague, and this is one thing that really came through was how I won't say desperate, but how strongly many of the participants wanted people to read their stuff.
My desperation, insofar as I'm desperate, best case scenario for this book. I know I'm not Stephen King. I know this thing is not going to fly off the shelves and land on the New York Times bestseller list. My end game is to be invited back to the dance. For somebody to say, "Oh, I like this book. I want to publish his next book." That's really all I want out of the deal. To be able to sit down and work on my next book, knowing that there's an editor and a publishing house waiting for it and eager to put it out into the world. To me, that's success. And because of the work I've done in this ghostwriting sideline of mine, I don't have to worry about an income stream while I'm doing that. So the goal really is the book itself. It's the thing itself. And I don't want to write this in a vacuum. I find it very hard to create not knowing if the thing is going to exist in the wild. So to me, the idea of having somebody eager to publish my next book, that's exciting.
What is that, though? That's some kind of recognition that makes you happy, or what?
I don't know, Nigel. It's a difficult thing to pinpoint. It's not about the money for me, but it's also not about navel gazing for me. I just don't want to do this and leave it. If all I was going to do is write my next book and stick it in a desk drawer and then move on to the next one, I wouldn't have the motivation or the creative juices to take me to the last page. Not because I want to be recognized, but I guess maybe I do to a degree. Not because I want to monetize this in a big time way, but I guess I do to a degree. Yes, not because of any of these things. I want to know that this thing will have a shot in the world. That
I think? Sorry, Dan. You know what I think? I think and I can relate to it because no one pays you to run a podcast unless you're Joe Rogan.
Right.
But I want people to see value in what I'm doing.
Yes. I think there's part of that too. But think of the thrill you'd get. Now, I don't know how you do this in the podcast world, but one of my secret fantasies, which I will share with your listeners, so it's not so secret, I've always wanted to sit down on a plane and put my seatbelt on and have the guy next to me pull a book out of his bag and have it be one of mine.
Right.
That to me would be the coolest thing to sort of eavesdrop. So I don't know what the podcast equivalent is because you can't really see what people are listening to. But imagine the thrill that you would get if you sat down next to someone on a plane and they were listening to your podcast.
I don't have to imagine it, Dan. I was in Hamilton, Ontario, a year or two ago. I was in this bookstore and I was talking to the owner, and someone came up to me and said, "Hey, you've got a podcast. I listened to your podcast. I recognized your voice." And you're right. That made me feel good. But again, what is it? It's like,
I think it comes down to we all want to be seen, right? And in
right,
your case, on the podcast, you want to be heard.
yeah,
We want to be seen. We want to leave a footprint.
right,
And
right.
it doesn't really matter to me whether that footprint brings me riches, brings me fame. It just matters to me that that footprint is there and someone can stumble upon it or not. So that's what I got.
That's a great place to end it, but I just want to ask one more question, and that is about
Yes.
ghostwriting. So why does it matter, that whole field? Like, why does it matter?
Well, a lot of the books I write as a ghostwriter are more merchandise than literature. So I don't know that it matters. Some of these
Right,
books are designed and constructed to capitalize on somebody's 15 minutes of fame.
right.
Someone's light is burning bright, and here's a piece of merchandise that we can use to make it burn brighter in this moment. In that sense, it doesn't matter. However, in that same sense, it matters a great deal to the people I'm working with. If you're an Olympic gold medalist and you come home and you've devoted your whole life to that goal, and you have an opportunity to write a motivational piece that might inspire young athletes to walk that same path, that matters a great deal to them in that moment. If you're looking to build a business and you feel that a book is an important takeaway or an adjunct to help you get your name across and jumpstart your business, that to them is important in that moment. So in the global scheme of things, a lot of them are not that important. But for the people I'm working with, in every case, they are powerfully important. And so some of that importance, I guess, attaches to the uplift I can feel in helping them to achieve that.
Yeah, you're helping them leave a footprint. So
Right.
I know we didn't talk that much about it, but let's recognize and at least give it a shot. The novel is called Balloon Dog, and who's it published by again?
It's published by Kohler Books, Koehler. You can find it wherever books are sold. If it's not in your bookstore, they can order it. If you buy books online, you can find it on every platform. You can get a print book, you can get a digital book.
Why should they read it?
Because it's a lot of fun. It's kind of dark. It's kind of different. People seem to really enjoy the book. One critic compared it to a mashup of a Carl Hiaasen book and a Jonathan Franzen book. There's a lot of domestic angst and ennui alongside this sort of bungled caper of this sculpture. So it's like the collision of a couple of different genres. But I had a lot of fun writing it, and I'm pretty confident that some of your listeners will have fun reading it. So if you do read it, send a review somewhere, wherever you buy your books, because that stuff is meaningful.
Very good. Okay. Well, thank you for helping with me with my mission to better understand every single aspect of the book, including ghostwriting. Thanks very much, Dan.
Thanks for having me on, Nigel. Nice to talk to you.
Okay. Likewise.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.